Looking back through history, the quintessential table saw is unarguably the Delta Unisaw. It's a tool that was manufactured and sold with very little changes from 1939 until 2009 or so. To put it simply, it's the flathead Ford of the wood shop. It's timeless, it's simple, it's robust, and I've always wanted one. A few weeks back, I finally got the opportunity to pick one up. I rented a U-Haul, drove to Houston, and bought it from a retired NASA engineer that had given it a quick spray bomb and bearing restoration. It was priced a little higher than I liked, but it was perfect, and I wasted no time getting it home to Dripping Springs. The saw came with an original jet-lock fence. These are beautiful units and mechanically interesting to ponder, but I really wanted to use a more modern Bizon style fence system. Commercially, these rails are available, but they are regularly priced at around $300, and from most reports, the quality is lacking. So I spent around $75 at my local steel supply joint and got busy building my own. The design of the Bizon fence rail is simple. You start by bolting a length of 3" by 3" by 1/4" angle iron to the table saw. Then you add a corresponding length of 2" by 3" by 11 gauge rectangular tubing. The only critical part of this operation is the spacing between these two lengths of steel and your saw. Once everything is all bolted to the table saw, you need the rectangular tubing to be spaced exactly 3/4 inch from the outmost face of the angle iron, and the top of that rectangular tubing needs to be spaced precisely 13/16 of an inch from the top of your table saw. Now, I actually filmed myself fabricating these rails. It's a simple process, and one that's pretty fun to tackle actually. Well, for the most part. And I was going to include that footage as part of this video, but Alan over at Very Super Cool Tools has already created a series on the topic, and he goes into far greater detail on the matter than I ever could. So rather than bore you with the details, I'll let him do it. And we will pick up with my project right around the time I finished the rails and got them mounted to the saw. The next step was to build the extension table. The idea here is to build a frame that will fit between the front and back rail of the fence, and then add a top that will someday be home to a router lift. I don't have the immediate budget for a lift at the moment, but I figured I might as well build for it now and save myself time in the future. I started with a piece of poplar that I cross-cut down to around 27 inches wide. I then would test the fit between the rails and recut, just sort of inching my way to a perfect fit. Once I had that fit, I could then set the stop on the MFT and quickly cut the rest of the cross members for the frame. Afterwards, I needed to rip each part down to 2 1/4 inches in width. I did this using my new VSC T-square fence on my table saw for the first time. It felt so smooth, the cuts were dead accurate. Throughout this project, I just got more and more excited about using a proper cabinet saw. I used dominoes to help me with the alignment of the frame, and then made sure everything was dead square before I glued and screwed the frame together. For the inner cross members, I just used a piece of scrap to make sure the parts stayed square, and then glued and screwed them as well. Once the glue was set up, I gave the frame a really quick and light sanding, and then test fit it between the rails. It fit perfectly, and I was able to move on to the top. I decided to use MDF here for its stability and flatness. I used the frame to set up the fence on the saw, and then cut the MDF to size. But before I could attach the top to the frame, I needed to figure out how the whole thing was going to mount to the saw itself. To give you an idea of what's going on here, this is the side of the extension table that butts up against the table saw. And there's 3 bolts on my table saw that this will bolt up to. However, they're located high enough on the table saw itself that the bolts will actually run into the 3/4 inch top that I'm using for the top of the extension table itself. So I've had to make provisions for those bolts, and what I'm doing is I'm just routing out about a 1/2 inch deep into this 3/4 inch piece of stock, just to make room to get the bolt through and have room to get a wrench in there and tighten it down. So it doesn't have to be pretty because you're never going to be able to see it. It's just got to be fairly accurate. I set up my guide rail to make these cuts, and it went pretty quickly. One thing to notice here is that I'm producing very little to no dust during this operation. And keep in mind this is MDF. There are times, especially as a guy that cherishes vintage tools, that I wonder about the value of Festool, and, well, this is not one of those times. that out of the way, I just need to screw and glue the top to the base. And real quick, I noticed as I was editing, I forgot to film the part where I actually used a router bit to flush trim the top to the base. But that happened. It's flush, it's even, it's square, everything's cool. This is the router insert side of the extension table, and I'm going to use some old vintage Delta splayed legs to support this end of the table. But my legs are 31 inches tall, which is about 3/8 of an inch too tall for the table. So what I'm going to do is, I took these pieces of scrap plywood and I'm going to glue them down inside. And then I'm going to take this piece of poplar and I'm going to machine it down to the height I need. And then I'm going to screw it in. And the idea behind that is if I need to unscrew it and make some fine-tune adjustments as far as height goes, I can do that. But this should give me a solid platform to lag screw my legs to. So we'll see how that goes. This plan seemed to work out okay. I got the height where I needed it and screwed it down to the table. So now it was time to move on to the actual surface of the extension table. I found a Wilson art laminate that I liked a lot. It was light enough that I'll be able to write on it just fine, but dark enough of a gray to match the dark machine gray of the saw itself. I used a contact cement to lay the laminate and just flush cut it with my palm router afterwards. You might also notice here that I went ahead and painted the poplar frame. I did that off camera in my pajamas late one night. The next step was to route out a relief in the top for the extruded aluminum miter slot that I bought from Woodpeckers. This was sort of stressful because one slip of the router would have scrapped the extension table altogether, but I just measured carefully, used my guide rail, and cut the slot in multiple passes. It went fine, but this time it created a ton of dust. It's essentially a through cut, so there's lots of opportunity for the dust to escape my collector. Next time I'll probably do this operation outside. But with that done, it was time to drill the holes in the side of the extension to accept the fence rails. This isn't a critical operation. You just drill some holes a little larger than your mounting hardware so that you have some adjustability when putting everything together. As such, I took on the job casually. So here's the damage. The laminate just chipped off just the surface, and I thought I could live with it, but man, I know I can't. It's just against my nature. So I have two options. I can rebuild this thing, or before I do that, I can try to run this edge through the table saw and just cut, 3/16 of an inch. It's risky biscuits for sure, and it probably won't work. I'll have to pull these screws first. But I'm going to have to rebuild it anyway, so I guess I might as well give it a shot. Alright, here we go. I chickened out with the table saw. I decided to use my track saw instead. I laid down some blue tape to help with tear out, measured for square about 5 times, and just let it rip. Alright, moment of truth. Holy crap, it worked. I had to do it in 2 cuts obviously, but the only residual from the whole screw up was that I got into my domino joint a little bit, and that's not a big deal as you'll never see this side of the extension once it's mounted on the saw. Anyway, with that done, I could mock up the extension on the saw, mark my holes in the fence, and move on to figuring out the legs. So this is an old Delta splayed leg bandsaw stand, I think. I picked it up a few months ago, and the idea is I'm going to cut about 3.5 inches off the top, use that as the mounting point for these Delta splayed legs on the extension table. And the end result will be something that looks kind of original to the Unisaw, and I don't know, it's just easy. So, and I have it. Let's get to it. I threw the metal blade on the bandsaw, slowed it down to a creep, and resawed the Delta base to the appropriate dimensions. Afterwards, a file did a fine job of cleaning up the edges. And that was pretty much it from a fabrication standpoint. I took everything apart and took the smaller parts to my brother's hot rod shop for sandblasting, and then cleaned up the bigger parts with manual labor. The next few days were spent getting high, coating everything in enamel dark machine gray. And the finish actually turned out pretty nice, and that made final assembly a bit stressful. It's weird. I know this saw is going to get beat to hell as I work with it, but I wanted it really nice to start with. Once it was all together, I just had the details to tend with. I mounted an original goose egg dust cover to the saw, and then treated the fence to a UHMW slide, and of course a measuring tape, taking special care to get it set up nice and accurately. A few years back when my dad passed away, I cleaned out his shop and I found this old Shopbox mobile base. And while it's ugly, it's pretty functional in that it's fairly sturdy. I eventually planned to make my own, but I figured this would work for now. And I made these little adapter plates so I could run these Footmaster casters. And if you're not familiar with these things are great because I can level out my table saw, get it really sturdy. And then when I need to, I can take a wrench, bring up the feet, and this whole thing is mobile, which is nice as well. But to make up the difference on the router side, I just added these adjustable feet. And again, when I make my own base, I'll probably integrate this in. But for now, I think this will work just fine. The finishing touch was an ode to the original owner back in Houston. I'm a space geek and a sucker for a good story, so yeah.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Well, that's it. She's done. Done for now anyways. Eventually I would like to add a router lift here. And like I said in the video, I've kind of built for it. Man, they're really expensive and I don't have the need for it yet. But once I do, I'm set up for it and it should be easy to add. Everything works fantastically. I put a thin kerf Woodworker 2 blade in it. It cuts wonderfully. This very Super Cool Tools fence is great. I love the way it's made. It's made like a brick shithouse actually. And it works well, no complaints there at all. The one thing I added to the saw that wasn't in the video was this shark guard. And this is sort of a manually adjustable riving knife. And it's sort of a pain in the ass to set up when you're doing, changing the height of the blade and things like that. But it's one of those products where you can tell the guy that makes it, and I think he makes these out of his garage, you can tell he's doing this for more than just making a profit. Like, it is made really well, and the attention to detail is amazing. It does add a step as far as if you want to change blade height, you have to take the guard off, and then you got to take the guard mount off, and then finally you can get into the riving knife and manually adjust it up and down. I'm scared to death of my table saw, and this is just sort of a safety precaution that to me is worth the hassle of the extra steps. You might be confident enough not to need it. I am not. So I'm really happy with it. And also, as a nice perk, the dust collection is fantastic on this thing. I'm really happy with that. And that's really the next step with this saw. I'm eventually going to do a dedicated outfeed table. Right now I'm using my MFT for an outfeed, but I'd like to do a small dedicated outfeed table. And then I got to add, cabinet dust collection to this as well. And so that's kind of on my list. But I get really tired of doing shop projects. I want to do real projects like building cabinets, things like that. So I might do another project before I get to all that. I don't know yet. I'm just kind of playing it by ear and when I have time. But yeah, thanks for following along, and I'll catch you next time.